I'm not proud of this, but there was a morning when I stood on my front porch holding a certified letter that claimed I owed $250,000 to my homeowners association. And by the time everything was over, the very people who threatened to take my home had watched the organization they built collapse beneath their own feet. If you told me a year earlier that an old metal box covered in dust would change the lives of more than 100 families, I would have laughed and offered you another cup of coffee. Funny how life works sometimes. It waits until you stop looking for miracles before dropping one right in your lap. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 56 years old, and until all of this happened, I thought I understood what it meant to keep your head down and mind your own business. I grew up in a little corner of western Tennessee where people waved from pickup trucks even if they didn't know your name, where fences weren't just property lines, they were promises between neighbors. The house I live in isn't fancy by any stretch. It's a white farmhouse with a deep porch, an old oak tree that probably remembers more history than I ever will, and a weathered storage shed sitting behind the garage. That shed mattered more to me than most people could understand because my father and I built it together the summer before cancer took him away. Every crooked nail, every board we argued over, every coat of paint. I could still hear his voice every time I opened that old wooden door. So whenever someone looked at that shed and saw nothing more than a violation, I saw Saturday mornings with my dad, saw sweat dripping off his nose while he grinned and said, "Good enough lasts longer than perfect." For years, my neighborhood was quiet. Most of us had been there since before the new development expanded across the old farmland. Then investors showed up, streets got wider, houses got bigger, and eventually somebody decided we needed an association to protect property values. That's always how they sell it, isn't it? Protection, stability, community. At first, honestly, it wasn't terrible. They sent newsletters about holiday decorations, reminded people to mow their lawns, organized a 4th of July picnic. I even volunteered to grill hamburgers one summer. Back then, nobody cared that my fence had faded a little under the Tennessee sun or that my garden used old limestone rocks my grandfather collected decades ago. Then the board elected a new president. Her name was Vanessa Holloway. If you've ever met someone who mistakes authority for importance, you already know exactly who she was. She dressed like she was running for governor every single day, drove a spotless black SUV that somehow never had a speck of dust on it, and smiled the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. The first time we spoke was actually pleasant enough. She introduced herself while I was trimming hedges and complimented my vegetable garden. 10 minutes later, she asked whether I planned on repainting my shed because, according to the neighborhood guidelines, the color was beginning to diminish visual harmony. I honestly laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. A week later, I received my first violation notice. Then another. Then another. Apparently, the mailbox post leaned 2 inches too far west. The decorative stones around my tomatoes weren't part of the approved landscaping palette. My fence had excessive weathering. Even the birdhouse my granddaughter painted one Easter suddenly became an issue because it wasn't listed among acceptable yard ornaments. I tried doing things the right way. I filled out appeal forms. I attended meetings. I asked questions politely. Every single time Vanessa would smile, thank me for my comments, then move on without addressing a single concern. The board always voted together. 5 hands went up. 5 hands came down. Case closed. My neighbors started whispering after meetings. A retired mechanic named Carl leaned over one evening and muttered, "She's not enforcing rules, Ethan. She's collecting trophies." I chuckled at the time, but the more months passed, the more I realized he might have been right. Every new violation felt personal somehow, almost like someone was driving through the neighborhood looking specifically for reasons to bother me. I later learned Vanessa often did exactly that. She'd cruise around after dinner with a clipboard resting on her passenger seat, taking pictures through her windshield like she was documenting crime scenes instead of flower beds. Still, I never imagined where it was leading. Then came that Tuesday morning. I'd just poured my second cup of coffee when the mail carrier knocked instead of dropping everything into the box. "Need your signature," he said quietly. Certified mail. My stomach tightened before I'd even opened it. I carried the envelope inside, sat at the kitchen table where my wife and I used to eat breakfast before she passed away 6 years earlier, and carefully unfolded nearly 30 pages of paperwork. By the 3rd page, my coffee had gone cold. According to the association, I'd accumulated years of unpaid violations, administrative penalties, legal processing fees, inspection costs, late charges, interest, and enforcement expenses. The total sat there in bold print at the bottom of the page. $250,000 for $118.73. Below it was a sentence that hit even harder. Payment required within 30 days or foreclosure proceedings may begin immediately. I must have read it 10 times because my brain refused to accept it. Foreclosure. Over a shed, faded fence paint, landscaping stones, and a birdhouse. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the papers. I grabbed my phone and called the association office before I could even think straight. Vanessa answered after 2 rings. Maple Ridge Community Association. I said, there has to be some mistake. I just got a notice saying you people are trying to take my house. She didn't even pause. Mr. Walker, there is no mistake. I want a hearing. You've already had opportunities. Then I want another one. I could hear papers shuffling on her desk before she finally sighed. The board voted unanimously. The matter is closed. I swallowed hard and said something I'd never mentioned at any meeting before. My family owned this land before there was ever a Maple Ridge. Before any of those houses existed. She laughed, not loudly, just enough to let me know exactly what she thought. Families like yours always think history gives them special treatment. It doesn't. Times change, Mr. Walker. Maybe it's time you changed too. Then the line went dead. I sat there staring at my reflection in the dark television across the room, hearing my father's voice somewhere deep in the back of my mind, remembering something my grandfather used to say whenever life cornered him. Never assume you've reached the end of the story until you've opened every box the family left behind. At first it sounded like nothing more than an old man saying. Then I suddenly remembered the dusty metal lockbox buried somewhere in my attic. The one my great-grandfather had left behind decades earlier with strict instructions that nobody throw it away. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I grabbed a flashlight, climbed the attic ladder, and started digging through boxes of Christmas decorations, convinced that whatever I found up there had to be better than losing everything I'd spent my entire life trying to protect. I finally found the box shoved all the way behind a stack of dusty Christmas ornaments and an old rocking horse my daughter had outgrown decades ago. It wasn't much to look at, just a dented steel lockbox with rust gathering around the hinges. But the second I picked it up, I realized it was heavier than I expected. My great-grandfather had always been known as the kind of man who never threw away a receipt, never signed a document without making 3 copies, and never trusted a handshake unless it was backed by paper. Growing up, everybody joked about his obsession with records. My grandfather used to laugh and say, if Noah had asked your great-granddad to build the ark, he'd have insisted on notarizing the flood first. Standing there in that attic, I couldn't help smiling at the memory, though the smile disappeared pretty quickly when I realized I had no idea how to open the box. The tiny brass key taped underneath the lid of an old cigar tin solved that problem. I don't know why I remembered it after all those years. Maybe desperation has a way of waking up forgotten memories. The lock clicked open with surprising ease. Inside were neatly bundled envelopes wrapped in faded string, dozens of handwritten letters, yellowed survey maps, tax receipts dating back to the 1940s, and one thick envelope marked in my great-grandfather's handwriting, property records. Never destroy. My heart started beating faster before I'd even opened it. I spread everything across the dining room table and spent the next 3 hours reading documents that felt like pieces of another lifetime. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect from a man who farmed hundreds of acres after World War II. Purchase agreements, equipment invoices, seed contracts. Then I unfolded one oversized survey map, and that's when I noticed something unusual. Across the bottom, typed in language that sounded almost foreign to me, were several legal reservations that had been retained when the original farmland was divided into residential parcels. One phrase appeared again and again. Permanent ingress and egress easement. Mineral estate reserved by grantor. I frowned. I wasn't a lawyer. I barely understood half the terminology, but I understood enough to know those weren't ordinary words. I grabbed my laptop, searched county GIS records, then overlaid the old survey with modern property maps. At first I assumed I'd made some kind of mistake because the lines simply didn't make sense. I zoomed in, zoomed back out, checked parcel numbers, compared roads, compared lot boundaries. My stomach dropped. The easement corridor wasn't limited to one or two houses. It stretched beneath nearly every road inside Maple Ridge Estates. Every cul-de-sac, every common entrance, even the clubhouse parking lot. Then I counted the parcels affected. 129, including Vanessa Holloway's house. I actually pushed myself away from the table because it felt ridiculous. Surely something that important would have been removed decades ago. Surely no modern developer would have overlooked paperwork that could affect an entire subdivision. I needed someone who actually knew what they were looking at. The next morning, I drove 30 miles to see Olivia Grant, a real estate attorney my late wife had hired years earlier when we settled her parents' estate. Olivia had been practicing property law for almost 30 years, and she wasn't the kind of lawyer who got excited easily. I placed the documents on her desk and apologized for wasting her time if it all turned out to be meaningless. She adjusted her glasses, quietly read the first deed, then the second, then unfolded the survey map. For nearly 5 full minutes, she didn't say a word. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, looked directly at me, and asked one question. "Mr. Walker, has anyone from that homeowners association ever seen these?" I shook my head. "Not that I know of." She smiled in a way that honestly made me nervous. Good. Because if these documents are authentic, and I believe they are, somebody made an extraordinarily expensive mistake. She explained everything slowly, almost like she was teaching a class. When my great-grandfather sold sections of the family farm to different buyers after the war, he intentionally retained 2 things. First, the mineral estate beneath the land. Second, perpetual access easements allowing future entry for inspection, maintenance, surveying, or resource development. Those rights had been properly recorded with the county. More importantly, nobody had ever filed the paperwork required to extinguish them. Every developer after that had apparently assumed the restrictions no longer mattered. They built roads anyway, built houses anyway, built an HOA clubhouse directly across part of the easement corridor. Olivia tapped the survey with her pen. This neighborhood has been operating for years under the assumption these rights disappeared. They didn't disappear. They were ignored. I asked the obvious question. Does that mean I own their neighborhood? She laughed softly. No, they own their homes. But they built an entire system on property rights your family never surrendered. Then she looked at me again. Considering they've threatened foreclosure against you, I'd say it's time they learn what due diligence actually means. Over the next week, my life became something I never could have imagined. Olivia filed notices with the county recorder, served easement enforcement demands, requested title reviews, and submitted formal complaints regarding obstruction of recorded access corridors. Every filing was supported by original documents, certified copies, historical surveys, and chain of title records that reached all the way back to 1947. 3 days later, sheriff's deputies delivered packets to every attorney representing the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. The reaction was almost immediate. Vanessa still acted confident in public. According to one neighbor, she told people the claims were frivolous intimidation tactics. But behind closed doors, things were changing. Carl stopped by my house carrying a 6-pack of root beer one evening and said, "You didn't hear this from me, but 3 board members left yesterday's meeting looking like somebody had just canceled Christmas." A week after that, county surveyors showed up, then title examiners, then representatives from the developer's insurance carrier. Pickup trucks with magnetic company logos started appearing around the neighborhood almost every day. People began asking questions. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everybody could tell something big was unfolding. One afternoon, I walked outside to find Vanessa standing at the end of my driveway wearing sunglasses and holding a folder against her chest. She waited until I reached the mailbox before speaking. "Mr. Walker, perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot." I couldn't help smiling. "That's funny. Last time we talked, you were trying to take my house." Her expression tightened for just a second before she recovered. "Misunderstandings happen." A $250,000 misunderstanding. She ignored the comment. "Our attorneys are reviewing certain historical records. We'd appreciate your patience." "I was patient when your board fined me over a birdhouse." She looked away. "There's no need for hostility." "Hostility," I said. "You laughed when I asked for a hearing." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked, "What exactly do you want?" I thought about that longer than she probably expected. Truth was, I hadn't spent the last week fantasizing about revenge. I'd spent most of it thinking about my father, my wife, and how easily everything we'd built together could have disappeared because somebody with too much authority decided rules mattered more than people. Finally, I answered, I don't want your house. I don't want anyone else's house. I just want fairness. She nodded without saying another word and walked back to her SUV. 2 days later, Olivia called. They're panicking. Apparently, the HOA had hired one of the largest property law firms in the state. After reviewing every document, every title report, and every county archive available, the firm's conclusion was devastating. The easements were valid. The mineral reservations were valid. The original recordings had never been released. Worse yet, the association itself had repeatedly obstructed those rights through gates, landscaping, utility improvements, and permanent structures. Every violation they'd committed potentially strengthened my legal position instead of weakening it. Olivia suggested we make one settlement offer before considering litigation. I agreed. We drafted a letter that fit on barely 2 pages. It wasn't filled with threats or dramatic language, just straightforward conditions. Immediately withdraw every violation, every fine, every foreclosure action. Permanently exempt my property from all future HOA restrictions through a recorded covenant. Compensate my family for years of unlawful interference with recorded easement rights through a structured monthly settlement. Finally, dissolve the current board and replace it with an independent transition committee elected by homeowners rather than appointed insiders. Olivia read it twice before sending it. If they refuse, she said calmly, their own legal fees will probably exceed what you're asking for. Less than 24 hours later, my phone rang. Vanessa's voice sounded completely different from the woman who'd laughed at me a few weeks earlier. It was quieter, almost tired. Mr. Walker, she said carefully, could we meet and discuss your proposal? I looked out the kitchen window toward my father's old shed, still standing exactly where we'd built it all those years ago, and for the first time since opening that certified letter, I realized the balance of power had shifted completely, though neither of us yet understood just how explosive the next neighborhood meeting was about to become. The emergency meeting started at 7, but by 6:30 the parking lot outside the Maple Ridge Clubhouse was already overflowing. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the street. Neighbors stood in little groups whispering to one another, and every few minutes someone glanced in my direction before quickly looking away. Rumors had been spreading for days. Some people believed I was about to sue every homeowner in the subdivision. Others thought the county was going to condemn the neighborhood. The truth was a lot less dramatic than the gossip, but in some ways it was even more devastating. I wasn't there to take anyone's home. I was there because I wanted mine back. I slipped into a chair near the rear of the room, while Olivia quietly organized a stack of folders beside me. Across the room, Denise Caldwell sat at the front table with the remaining board members. Gone was the confidence she'd worn every time she dismissed my concerns. Tonight, she looked exhausted. There were dark circles beneath her eyes. Her hair wasn't nearly as perfect as usual, and she kept whispering to the attorney sitting beside her. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the laughter on the phone when she told me my family didn't belong there, and whatever sympathy I might have found disappeared just as quickly as it came. The attorney stood first. He didn't waste time with introductions or formalities. Our firm has completed an independent review of the property's recorded history, he began. Based on that review, we have concluded that the easement reservations and mineral rights retained by Mr. Walker's family remain valid and enforceable. The room became so quiet I could hear the air conditioning kick on overhead. He continued explaining the chain of title, the original surveys, and the legal obligations that had been overlooked for decades. He spoke calmly, without emotion, but every sentence seemed to make the atmosphere heavier. Finally, he reached the conclusion everyone had been waiting for. Continuing litigation would expose this association and its members to substantial financial liability with little chance of prevailing. That was the moment everything changed. Hands shot into the air. Voices overlapped. One homeowner stood and demanded to know why the board had threatened foreclosure before verifying the legal history of the land. Another wanted to know how much association money had already been spent fighting a case their own attorneys believed they couldn't win. Then someone near the front asked a question that nobody on the board seemed prepared for. Exactly how much has our president been paid? The treasurer hesitated, looked toward Denise, then quietly read the numbers from a financial report. Salary, consulting fees, vehicle reimbursement. administrative bonuses. The total approached $95,000 a year. A wave of disbelief rolled through the room. An elderly man who had lived there almost as long as I had slowly stood up and shook his head. "We've been paying higher dues every year," he said. And all this money was being spent while neighbors were getting fined over flower beds and mailbox posts. Nobody answered him because there wasn't a good answer to give. Within minutes, the discussion turned into a vote. One motion removed every current board member from office. Another suspended all active enforcement actions. Then came the final vote, whether to dissolve the existing HOA and replace it with a voluntary neighborhood association with no authority to fine or foreclose. When the ballots were counted, it wasn't even close. The motion passed by an overwhelming margin. Just like that, years of fear, resentment, and unnecessary conflict came to an end. Over the following weeks, the paperwork moved surprisingly fast. Every violation against my property was formally withdrawn. The foreclosure notice was canceled. A recorded covenant permanently exempted my land from future HOA restrictions, recognizing rights that should never have been ignored in the first place. The financial settlement we negotiated wasn't about revenge. It covered the legal costs and years of interference, but it was far less than what a prolonged court battle could have become. That mattered to me because I never wanted innocent families paying for someone else's bad decisions. Denise resigned before the transition was complete. A couple of months later, I heard she'd moved away. Maybe she wanted a fresh start. Maybe she simply couldn't bear driving past my house every day. Either way, I never contacted her again. There wasn't anything left to say. One evening, not long after everything settled down, my neighbor Carl carried 2 lawn chairs into my backyard along with a cooler full of iced tea. We sat beside the old shed my father and I had built all those years ago, watching the sun settle behind the trees. After a long silence, he chuckled and said, "You know, this whole mess started because somebody couldn't leave one old shed alone." I laughed harder than I had in months because he was right. The shed was still standing. The weathered fence was still exactly where it had always been. The limestone rocks still bordered my vegetable garden, and every spring my granddaughter painted another little birdhouse to hang from the oak tree. Funny thing is, nobody complains about any of it anymore. These days neighbors stop by to chat instead of inspect. Kids ride bicycles through the streets again without parents worrying about another warning letter showing up in the mailbox. It finally feels like the kind of community my family believed in from the very beginning. Every now and then I open that old metal lockbox and flip through the papers my great-grandfather left behind. Looking at those worn documents reminds me that the most valuable things we inherit aren't always money or land. Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's integrity. And sometimes it's the foresight of someone who understood that the truth, carefully preserved, might one day protect people he would never even meet. Looking back now, I don't think this story is really about property rights or homeowners associations. It's about what happens when authority forgets its purpose. Rules should exist to help neighbors live together, not to give one person the power to bully another. I'd love to know what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted the settlement, or would you have taken the case all the way through trial? Do you think the homeowners deserved a second chance after trusting the wrong leadership, or should they have shared responsibility for what happened? Let me know in the comments. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or uncovered an old family document that changed everything, share your story too. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.